Okay, so you want to own a tattoo studio. You've walked past one on a Friday night. Neon signs glowing in the window. Dark interior with exposed brick walls. Artists bent over clients. Machines humming. Flash art covering every surface. The front desk handling bookings while someone gets a full sleeve. Deposit notifications hitting the iPad every hour. You think that's a real business? People always want tattoos. How hard can it be? That's a reasonable thought, and it's also almost completely wrong. The gap between what a tattoo studio looks like from the street and what it actually costs to run from the inside is one of the most quietly brutal gaps in all of creative small business. Tattoo studios close all the time, not because they ran out of clients, but because they ran out of cash while the appointment book was still full. Today, we're going to walk through exactly why that happens. Every dollar that comes in, every dollar that disappears before the owner ever sees it, and what the ones who actually make money are doing differently. Let's start with the first thing everyone gets wrong. A tattoo studio with a 6-month waitlist is not necessarily a tattoo studio that is profitable. Those are two completely separate facts. Revenue is not profit. A studio can collect $40,000 in a single month and still struggle to make rent. The question is never how many appointments are booked. The question is how much stays after everything that has to be paid gets paid. And in the tattoo business, that list of things that have to be paid is much longer than most artists expect when they make the jump from working in someone else's shop to opening their own. But before we get to the ongoing costs, we need to talk about what it costs just to open the doors on day one. Before a single needle touches skin, the money is already leaving. The median startup cost for opening a new tattoo studio in the United States sits around $100,000. That's the middle. The range runs from $50,000 on the very low end for a minimal private studio setup to $250,000 for a multi-station studio in a premium location with a full build-out. Here's where it goes. The biggest single chunk is leasehold improvements and studio build-out. A tattoo studio is not a regular commercial space. It needs to meet specific health department requirements. Medical-grade flooring that's non-porous and can be sanitized. Dedicated hand-washing stations with hands-free operation. Autoclave sterilization rooms with proper ventilation. Separate waiting areas from work areas to maintain sterile protocols. Proper lighting. Tattoo work requires high-quality lighting that renders color accurately without shadows. That build-out alone runs between $20,000 and $80,000 depending on the condition of the space when you take it and the local health code requirements in your jurisdiction. Then you have the actual equipment. A professional tattoo machine runs between $300 and $800 per unit. But no serious artist uses just one machine. You need multiple machines for lining, shading, and color packing. Power supplies run $200 to $500 each. Tattoo chairs or tables designed for client comfort during long sessions cost between $800 and $3,000 per station. An autoclave, the sterilization unit required by health departments in most states, costs between $1,500 and $5,000 depending on capacity. Ultrasonic cleaners for pre-sterilization add another $300 to $800. Workstations, rolling carts, storage cabinets, mirrors, reception desk. By the time you furnish a 3-station studio properly, you've spent between $15,000 and $40,000 before anyone has opened a needle. Initial supply inventory adds another $5,000 to $15,000. Professional tattoo ink in every color, needles in every configuration, disposable grips, barrier film, medical-grade gloves, green soap, antibacterial solutions, transfer paper, stencil products, aftercare ointments, and all the single-use supplies that health codes require. All purchased before you generate a single dollar of revenue. Then there are the costs that don't show up in the social media posts about studio openings. Commercial landlords want a security deposit equal to 1 to 3 months of base rent before you get the keys. Business licenses, health department permits, bloodborne pathogen certifications, and commercial liability insurance specifically covering tattoo work add another $3,000 to $8,000 upfront. That insurance is expensive because the liability exposure is real. One infection, one allergic reaction, one claim of permanent scarring, the insurance premium reflects that risk. And then there's working capital, the cash reserve you keep in the bank to cover your fixed expenses during the first several months while you're still building a client base and before the business reaches break-even. The standard recommendation is $15,000 to $35,000 sitting in reserve. Most new studio owners underestimate this badly, which is why so many studios that open with hype run into a cash crisis by month 4 or 5. Before we get to location, there's a business model decision that shapes the entire financial structure of the operation. And most new owners inherit it from whatever shop they worked at before rather than choosing it strategically. When you bring a tattoo artist into your studio, you have two fundamental ways to structure the relationship. The first is commission-based employment. The artist works as an employee or contractor and receives a percentage of every tattoo they complete, typically between 40 and 60% of the total price. So if an artist completes a tattoo that bills $500, the studio keeps between $200 and $300, and the artist takes home $200 to $300. The owner provides all the supplies, the needles, ink, machines, sterilization, and the space. The artist generates the revenue. The second model is booth rental, also called chair rental. Under this arrangement, the artist pays you a fixed weekly or monthly fee to use a station in your space. That fee typically runs between $150 and $500 per week depending on the market and what's included. The artist sets their own prices, buys their own supplies, and keeps every dollar they collect from clients. You collect a predictable rent check regardless of how busy or slow their week was. These two models create entirely different businesses. Under commission, your upside is theoretically unlimited. If every station is booked solid and your pricing is strong, the margins can be excellent. But you bear all the downside too. You own the supplies that get consumed on every tattoo. You handle all the sterilization, all the administrative work, all the compliance. If an artist has a slow month, you still paid for the ink they used and the needles they opened. Under booth rental, income is predictable but capped. You cannot capture the upside of an artist's viral Instagram post that triples their bookings. And because they're legally independent contractors, you have very limited ability to enforce studio aesthetic, operating hours, or service standards. In most major U.S. cities, experienced tattoo artists with established followings increasingly prefer booth rental because they keep more of what they earn. That trend is making the commission model progressively harder to staff with top-tier talent. Now, let's talk about location because this is where the strategic trap lives. Cheap rent in a location with no foot traffic sounds smart until you realize that tattoo studios don't rely on walk-ins the way they did 20 years ago. The business has moved almost entirely to appointment-based work booked through Instagram and online portfolios. So location matters less for visibility and more for client experience and parking access. But premium rent is its own trap. In major U.S. cities, commercial rent for a studio-appropriate space in a desirable neighborhood runs $3,500 to $7,000 per month or more. And that's before you add common area maintenance charges, property taxes, and insurance pass-throughs. The true cost of occupying the space is often 15 to 20% higher than the base rent line. That rent figure is fixed. It does not go down when bookings slow. It does not go down during a slow season. It does not care how many clients showed up. Every month, that number is due, regardless of what the appointment schedule looked like. The cost of running a tattoo studio every single day starts long before any client walks in. Let's build out what a typical month actually looks like financially for a mid-sized tattoo studio in a competitive U.S. market. Say a 3-station space generating around $30,000 a month in gross revenue. The first and largest cost is artist compensation. Total artist payouts, whether commission-based or booth rental, consume between 50 and 60% of gross revenue in commission-based studios. On $30,000, that's between $15,000 and $18,000 per month going to artists before the owner takes a dollar for themselves. In booth rental models, this number is more predictable but often slightly lower as a percentage of studio revenue. Then rent on a decent location, call it $4,000 to $6,000 per month. Utilities, electricity, water for sterilization and cleaning, trash disposal including medical waste disposal which costs more than standard trash service, add another $400 to $800 monthly. Supply costs in a commission-based studio, the ink, needles, grips, gloves, barrier film, cleaning solutions, aftercare products, target 8 to 15% of gross revenue when managed carefully. On $30,000, that's $2,400 to $4,500 per month just in consumable supplies. When these costs aren't tracked carefully, when artists overink, when supplies get wasted, when inventory isn't monitored, these costs creep to 18 to 20% of revenue. And that difference alone can be the margin between profit and loss. Sterilization costs are often invisible to people outside the industry. Autoclave operation requires distilled water, sterilization pouches, chemical indicators, and biological spore testing to verify the autoclave is functioning correctly. Health departments in most states require documented spore testing monthly. Add another $200 to $400 monthly for sterilization supplies and compliance documentation. Marketing costs, paid social media advertising, professional photography of finished work, website maintenance, Google ads for local search, add another 3 to 6% of revenue in a competitive market. Software subscriptions for booking systems, point-of-sale processing, accounting tools, and digital consent forms add $150 to $400 per month. Credit card processing fees on every transaction run approximately 2.5 to 3% of total sales. Add it up. On $30,000 in monthly revenue, a well-managed but not exceptional studio is looking at $25,000 to $28,000 in total outgoing expenses. That leaves $2,000 to $5,000 in net profit, a margin of 7 to 17%. That margin has zero room for error. One health department violation requiring immediate correction, one artist who quits mid-month, one slow week during a local event that clears the city. Any of those events can erase the entire month's profit and push the business into a loss. Now, here's something most people watching from the outside never think about: the cost of an empty chair. In a tattoo studio, every hour of every operating day has a fixed cost attached to it, whether someone is getting tattooed or not. Rent continues, utilities continue, software subscriptions continue, insurance continues. The math is straightforward. If a 3-station studio pays $10,000 per month in fixed overhead and operates 200 hours per month, each station costs $16.67 per hour just in fixed expenses. If average station utilization is sitting at 50%, meaning stations are occupied only half the time, then the effective fixed cost per active station hour doubles to $33.34. An empty chair isn't a neutral event. It's an ongoing expense. The industry average for station utilization in appointment-based studios sits around 55 to 65%. Top-performing studios push that number to 75 to 85%. That gap, 20 to 30 percentage points of utilization, is often the entire difference between a studio that barely survives and one that generates strong, consistent profit. Now, let's talk about the part of the business where the real money actually lives. And it's not the small flash tattoo. A standard flash piece, a pre-designed tattoo in the $80 to $150 range, takes 60 to 90 minutes. Do the math. Custom large-scale work is a completely different financial category. A full-back piece takes between 30 and 60 hours of work and commands between $5,000 and $15,000 depending on the artist's reputation. A full sleeve, 15 to 30 hours of work, runs $2,000 to $6,000. A large custom chest piece, 10 to 20 hours, runs $1,500 to $4,000. The supply cost for a large custom piece, the ink, needles, and disposables, runs between $80 and $200 when managed carefully. So you're looking at work that generates after materials $1,800 to $5,800 in gross contribution per completed project, compared to a flash piece that generates $50 to $120 in gross contribution after labor and materials. This is why successful studios build their revenue models around custom work from established artists with strong portfolios. Flash and walk-in work fill gaps in the schedule. Custom large-scale projects build the margin. There's another revenue stream that the best-run studios treat seriously, and most owners ignore: retail merchandise, aftercare products, branded apparel, art prints from resident artists, piercing jewelry if the studio offers piercing services. The margin on retail is 50 to 70%, and it requires no chair time and no artist labor. Top-performing studios generate 5 to 10% of their total revenue from retail and merchandise. Industry average studios generate 1 to 3%. On a $30,000 monthly revenue base, that gap is between $300 and $2,700 in additional monthly profit that costs almost nothing to produce. Before we go further, if you're finding this breakdown useful and you want to understand how businesses like this actually work under the surface, subscribing to the Money Map and leaving a like genuinely helps us keep making these. Now, back to what's draining the profit before it ever lands. The tattoo business runs on appointments, and appointments have a hidden financial risk that most studio owners underestimate. No-shows and last-minute cancellations. When a client books a 4-hour session and simply doesn't show up, that chair generates zero revenue for 4 hours, but the fixed overhead for those hours is still running, and the time slot is gone. Cannot be recovered or resold after the fact. Appointment time is perishable. Across the industry, no-show and last-minute cancellation rates run between 15 and 30% in studios that haven't implemented deposit systems. The fix exists. Mandatory non-refundable deposits at the time of booking, typically $100 to $200 or 20 to 30% of the estimated total, whichever is higher. Automated reminder sequences sent 48 hours before the appointment. Clearly communicated cancellation policies posted on booking pages and included in confirmation emails. Studios that implement these systems bring their no-show rates down to 5 to 8%. That single operational change, applied consistently, can recover thousands of dollars in monthly lost revenue. Now, let's talk about the thing that can destroy years of carefully built business in a matter of days. Health code violations. A tattoo studio operates under constant regulatory scrutiny. Local health departments conduct unannounced inspections. One critical violation, improper sterilization procedures, cross-contamination evidence, failure to maintain proper documentation, can result in immediate closure until corrected. The cost isn't just the fine. It's the lost revenue during closure, the cost of emergency corrections, and the long-term reputational damage. A health code violation posted publicly online or reported in local media suppresses bookings for months afterward. The studios that avoid this maintain obsessive sterilization protocols, conduct internal audits weekly, and train every artist on bloodborne pathogen procedures even if they're working under a booth rental arrangement. Let's talk about seasonality because the calendar affects this business more than most artists realize. Tattoo studio revenue does not flow evenly across the year. Summer months, June through August, are typically the strongest. People have more exposed skin, more vacation time, more disposable income post-tax season. The weeks leading up to major holidays, Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, see booking surges. But January and February are reliably slow as clients recover from holiday spending. March can be dead depending on your market. The problem is structural. Revenue can drop by 25 to 40% between peak and trough months. But the rent doesn't drop. The insurance doesn't drop. The software subscriptions don't drop. A studio that generates $45,000 in July and then $27,000 in February has to cover the same fixed overhead both months. The owners who handle seasonality well operate from a cash reserve built during the strong months. They also run demand-stimulating events during slow periods. Flash days with discounted pre-designed work, Friday the 13th specials, Valentine's-themed events, not to give their work away cheaply, but to keep station utilization from falling below the break-even threshold. Now, let's talk about the thing that looks like the obvious next step after a successful first studio expansion, and why doing it too early reliably destroys profitable businesses. A studio owner opens their first location, builds a strong artist roster, and starts generating consistent net profit. The natural instinct is, let's open a second location. The problem is that a successful first studio very often depends on the owner being physically present. They're managing the artists, handling the difficult clients, maintaining quality control, managing the social media that drives bookings. When that owner splits their time to launch a second location, quality at the first location often starts to decline. The senior artist who drives 40% of the bookings starts getting approached by competitors or considers opening their own space. Cash from the first location gets redirected to fund early operating losses at the second site. If the first location then hits a slow period, the entire operation can become financially distressed simultaneously. The owners who expand successfully do it after they've removed themselves from day-to-day operations at the first location, hired a capable studio manager, and built documented procedures that don't rely on their personal presence. After the first location has produced 6 to 12 months of clean net profit without the owner behind the desk, that's a much higher bar than most people clear before they sign a second lease. Let's zoom out and look at where this all lands financially. The tattoo industry in the United States generates approximately $1.6 billion in annual revenue across more than 21,000 tattoo studios. Median annual studio revenue for a small to mid-size operation is approximately $250,000 to $350,000. At a net margin of 12%, that's $30,000 to $42,000 in annual net profit before the owner draws a salary. At a net margin of 8%, well within normal for a mid-performing operator, that drops to $20,000 to $28,000. The owner of a mid-performing studio is typically working 40 to 50 hours per week, managing artists, handling bookings, managing vendors, maintaining compliance, and often still tattooing to fill gaps in the schedule. $20,000 to $42,000 in annual net return for that workload in a business requiring $80,000 to $150,000 in startup capital is thin by any financial standard. The top 10% of studios operate in a completely different category. Average transaction size at top-performing studios runs around $450 to $650 compared to the industry baseline of $200 to $300. Net profit margins of 18 to 25% on a properly scaled revenue base can generate over $80,000 in annual retained net profit. But reaching that tier requires treating the studio as a system, not a creative collective, not a passion project, but a structured operation with managed unit economics, tracked supply costs, disciplined booking procedures, and intentional artist development. So, what actually determines whether this business works? It's not talent with a machine. Plenty of phenomenally skilled artists own studios that fail financially. The variable that separates the survivors from the closures is how rigorously the owner manages the numbers. Artist compensation must stay at or below 50 to 60% of gross revenue. If it creeps above 65%, the studio mathematically cannot cover its other fixed expenses at typical revenue levels. Rent should sit below 18 to 20% of gross revenue. Supply costs must stay between 8 and 15%, which requires actively tracking inventory by artist, not just ordering more ink when you run low. No-show rates need active management through deposits and technology. Custom large-scale work needs to represent at least 40% of total revenue. Seasonal cash reserves need to be built during strong months so the slow months don't become a survival exercise. And marketing needs to be treated as a fixed-line item, not the first thing cut when cash gets tight. Because cutting marketing during a slow period makes the slow period longer. So, is owning a tattoo studio actually worth it? If you walk in thinking the skill that creates beautiful ink is the skill that builds the business, it probably isn't worth it. Most people who approach it that way end up working 50-hour weeks for the equivalent of a modest hourly wage with no equity building underneath them and one bad month away from serious trouble. But if you walk in treating it as a structured service operation with real cost tracking, real booking discipline, real artist management, and real financial forecasting, the tattoo studio business can be genuinely lucrative. A top-tier operator running a well-built studio in the right market generates over $80,000 per year in net profit on an initial investment of $100,000 to $200,000. That's a real return. That's a real business. The artists who matter in this industry are the ones who can do two things at once. Create something that a client will wear permanently on their body with pride, and run the numbers behind that art tightly enough that the business is still standing 5 years later. The machine creates the art. The discipline builds the business. If this breakdown changed how you think about what's actually going on inside a business that looks simple from the outside, please like the video and subscribe to the Money Map if you haven't already. We break down the hidden economics behind industries like this every week. Thanks for watching.